Welcome to the GCSE Sociology Warmup session for Paper 1. We've produced two videos to help you with your last minute preparation for the Paper 1 exam on Monday. This one focuses on the sociology of education. Don't forget to watch the one on families if you haven't already done so. So let's remind ourselves of the most basic information about this exam. You will sit it on the afternoon of Monday the 16th of May and it lasts for an hour and 45 minutes. It covers the sociology of families and education, and there will be some research methods included too. Hopefully you are familiar with the advanced information for the higher tariff questions in this paper. They cover family forms, how family forms differ in the UK and within a global context, divorce, changes in the pattern of divorce in Britain since 1945 and the consequences of divorce for family members and structures, roles and functions of education and the views from the different perspectives on this, and processes within schools that affect educational achievement. Please remember, advanced information is about the higher tariff questions though. Anything from the rest of the spec could be covered in those lower tariff questions. So we know what the focus of the higher tariff questions will be, but let's remind ourselves of the topics that could be tested in the low tariff questions. When studying families, you will have covered the function of families. Think about the work of Parsons and Murdoch here. Family forms, conjugal role relationships, such as Warmup and Young, changing relationships in the family, and criticisms of the family. Think about the feminist perspective, in particular the work of Oakley, and then divorce. In the education unit, you will have covered roles and functions of education. So again, think about Durkheim and Davis and Moore, the relationship between education and capitalism, so looking at Bowes and Gintes, but also marketisation. So think about Ball, Bow and Gertwitz, and education achievement and the processes within schools, looking at things like labelling theory and anti-school subcultures. Throughout the paper, there will be some questions about sociological research methods, and some of those might be in reference to key studies. Right, let's start to focus on the advanced information topics for education. Our first one is roles and function of education. This includes different types of school, so things like alternative provision, homeschooling and deschooling, functions of education, so Durkheim and social cohesion, for example, functions of education, so Parsons and secondary socialisation, and feminist perspective, which is talking about the hidden curriculum reinforcing patriarchal values. So let's have a look at the different types of education that are on offer in the UK. Each of the key terms has had their vowels changed to an alternative vowel. Can you please work? Okay, here's our first one. We'll give you a few moments to try and work out. Remember the altered vowels. Remember the vowels have been altered. So what you're seeing on the screen obviously looks like complete and utter nonsense. If you change those vowels around, it would reveal a correct term. Okay, how did you get on? Well, hopefully you've spotted it is comprehensive schools. So comprehensive state schools are secondary schools that do not select their intake based on ability. They're free to attend and they're funded by the government. There are around 20,000 of them in in England, not the UK, and they're attended by 93% of secondary age children. In the past, children mainly went to their closest secondary school, although this has changed more recently due to marketising. Okay, here's our next one. Again, I'll give you a few moments to try and work this one out. It looks quite a lot easier, this one. Okay, hopefully you have spotted it is grammar school. So grammar schools are free to attend, but they are selected through the 11+ exam, which tests maths, verbal reasoning, comprehension and creative writing. They are more exclusive and often seen as superior to comprehensive schools because they usually get better exam results, which is hardly surprising as they select the most academically able students in the first place. They also tend to be overrepresented by middle-class families, as they're the ones that can afford expensive tuition to pass the 11+ exam in the first place. We used to have far more grammar schools, but in the 1960s, the government decided that they were divisive and everyone should be accepted into schools and taught in the same way. Okay, our next one is up on the screen now. So again, we'll give you a few moments to try and work this one out. Okay, how have you got on? So this is independent schools. So these are schools that parents pay to send their children to, and they're also known as private schools, and they are schools that can set their own fees. Because of this, they're able to afford specialist facilities and resources and smaller class sizes. They tend to offer additional opportunities that state schools are unable to, such as networking opportunities, but critics do say that these schools reinforce the class divide. Okay, our next one is on the screen. Again, I'll give you a few moments to try and work it out. Okay, so the key term that we have on the screen is multi-academy trust. So academies were originally introduced to help failing schools. However, most schools in England are now academies after the government announced that all schools should convert. They're still state funded, but they're independent of local authorities and they can decide on their own curriculum, levels of pay for staff, length of school day and holidays, and admissions criteria. For example, whether the children of staff get priority when applying for a place. So a multi-academy trust, or a MAT, is a group of schools governed by one trust and a single board of directors. The idea here is that schools can benefit from economies of scale. For example, all HR or IT will be done through the trust rather than having lots of individual support teams in individual schools. And there is often collaboration between schools to improve standards within lessons. All staff are employed by the trust, not the school, so they can be moved between schools if needed. However, some argue that academies are run like big businesses and not schools, and the big salaries given to CEOs of trusts are controversial when school budgets have been cut and departments are struggling to afford exercise books and, of course, glue sticks. The last key term to guess is on the screen. Again, we'll give you a few moments to see how you get on. Okay, it is homeschooling. So there are many reasons that parents choose to homeschool. Often this is linked to SEND needs not being met in mainstream education, but there are other reasons such as belief that the education system is too restrictive and exam focused. After the COVID lockdowns, there was an increase in people choosing to homeschool, although there were far more parents screaming never again. Sometimes there is a period of deschooling where children focus on what they enjoy rather than a formal curriculum. The idea here that this will reignite a love of learning. We did mention at the start of this bit about how homeschooling is often linked to SEND needs not being met in mainstream education. We have not got any more altered vowels, but there is one last type of schooling that you need to be aware of, and that's alternative provision. So in the past, these have been known as pupil referral units, or special schools also come under that umbrella as well. So alternative provision, and these are really tailor-made, small-scale schooling where you might have 3 or 4 children in the class, really personalised learning, and these are for children who are not in school for a variety of reasons. So it might be medical, it might be behaviour, it might be some sort of learning condition that is just not being supported or cannot be supported properly in mainstream education. Okay, so let's have a think about homeschooling. We're going to use the on balance activity to get us to think about the skill of evaluation. So we're going to have a look at the advantages and disadvantages of this type of education. So I'm going to give you a few moments to come up with some advantages. You might want to pause the video for a few minutes, and then we're going to do the same for disadvantages. Okay, let's see how you got on. Well, many people argue that the learning is much more personalised and tailored to the interests of the child. So, for example, there might be a focus on the arts, there might be a focus on music, there might be a focus on STEM subjects, so science, technology, English and maths. This is likely to mean that the child is increasingly engaged, they're likely to do better because they're enjoying their learning. And actually, studies do show that children who are homeschooled often get exceptional grades, and they often take their exams much earlier than if they were in mainstream education. There is also no teaching to the test, which can lead to a deeper learning and understanding. In schools, sometimes we are really struggling with the level of content that you can't really go into things as deep as you want to. That means that the understanding isn't quite as good as it should be, as we're just racing to get through content. So in this case, this is a real benefit of homeschooling. Right, let's see if you can come up with 2 disadvantages of homeschooling. So we've talked about the good points about it, but there are lots of drawbacks of homeschooling as well. So have a think about what they might be. And again, pause the video if you need. Okay, in terms of disadvantages, the first one we've got is a financial cost. So it does take a big commitment from parents to do homeschooling. So one parent might have to give up work, and there will be lots of resources to buy, because obviously you can't just set up sort of an education plan without any additional support. There are lots of resources that will be needed for all subjects. So it is a really expensive thing for parents to commit to. There is also the lack of socialisation that many people argue. So students might not learn how to deal with conflict, so potentially might be less resilient in the future. However, again, there are lots of homeschool groups set up at the moment because homeschooling has become far more popular over the last few years. So this is one way that children are getting that socialisation that is really vital as they're growing up. Okay, so remember, the point of the on-balance activity is to ensure that when you are discussing two sides of something, that you are presenting a balanced case. So here we have got lots of advantages of homeschooling. We've also talked about the disadvantages. It's a really good method when you are evaluating something in sociology. Okay, we're going to do a 60-second challenge now. You've got 60 seconds to match the key term to the definition on the next screen. There'll be 6 of them, and they are all to do with the function of education. So you just need to match the letters on the left with the numbers on the right, and you have 60 seconds to do that. Good luck. Okay, let's check your answers. So we have role allocation. Unequal rewards means that people will get jobs that matches their ability and the effort they're prepared to make. So that's A4. Social cohesion, a sense of unity with others and strong bonds between members of society, B3. Achieve status that has been earned and not born into, which is C5. Meritocracy, where everybody has an equal opportunity to succeed, which is D2. We've got the hidden curriculum. Schools teach their pupils a whole range of other things in a more subtle or covert way, for example, respecting authority and understanding hierarchy, which is E1. And ascribe status that you were born into, such as being part of the royal family, F6. Now, we are going to talk about all of those key terms in the next section of this video. So Functionalist Durkheim talks about the idea of social cohesion, and social cohesion being something that schools promote. It's the idea of learning the formal curriculum, which gives us a sense of belonging to something bigger than ourselves. It educates us about things that are going on around the world, so it makes us realise that it's not just us, there are other things out there. And this promotes a sense of unity and stronger bonds between members of society. He also talks about that sense of community being promoted through things like assemblies, ceremonies, things like that celebrate achievements. But you could also argue that things like wearing the same uniform would promote that sense of belonging, that sense of being a part of a community. Tutor time every morning, again, that sort of collective checking in, being registered, all of those things give us that sense that we are part of something, we are part of a community. That was a really important function of education. He also talked about schools being really important in terms of secondary socialisation. So we know that primary socialisation is the idea of families teaching their children the norms and values of society. But secondary socialisation is what takes over when children start going to school, in fact. So schools are an agent of socialisation. They reinforce the norms and values of society for the next generation. Now that is really important, particularly from those families where perhaps primary socialisation hasn't been as strong as it should have been. So children will learn what is expected of them, and they learn common norms and values which will enable them to function in society properly, but it will also enable society to function properly. Everybody is sharing the same norms, the same values. It's that idea of that consensus theory that sociologists, so functionalist sociologists are so. Durkheim also talked about one of the functions of education being teaching of specialist skills and preparing students for the world of work and what lies beyond them when they leave school. He said that teaching skills that are really important for the future, like the future economy, is a vital role of schools. So either through academic subjects such as your GCSEs and your A-levels, or through vocational subjects. So there are less options for vocational subjects when you're in year 10 and 11, but certainly when you get to A-level, so your post-16 options, there is a variety that you can take there. And again, that idea of education preparing us for the world, giving us skills to succeed outside of school. So industry does need that complex division of labour. We all start off learning the same, but we specialise later. And that specialisation starts really halfway through year 9 when you start picking your GCSE options, where you start planning for the things that you know are going to be more useful to you in the future. So as I've already mentioned, schools are an agency of secondary socialisation, socialising children into society's norms and values and taking over from the family. So Talcott Parsons believed that when families socialise their children, they often make allowances for them, but they only reinforce the values important to them as a family, rather than the universal values that underpin society. So he said that schools act as a bridge between home and wider society. He talked about the idea of universal values whereby all pupils will be judged on the same criteria. They should be treated equally in education. For example, they all sit the same standardised tests and they all follow the same curriculum. Parsons argued that schools are important for meritocracy and for achieving status. Meritocracy is the principle of rewarding people based on ability and effort, and Parsons argued that schools reward those who work the hardest and that everyone has the opportunity to succeed. Achieve status. So children is all about the idea of status that you earn, and he says that schools teach you how to achieve this, judging on how clever you are and how hard you work and making you earn positions. So for example, in teams and school performances, as opposed to ascribed status that you're born into. Meritocracy fits in nicely with Davis and Moore's theory of role allocation, selecting people for their future jobs, whereby the most respected and financially rewarding jobs go to those who are most willing and able to put in the effort to qualify them, for example, doctors and barristers. Finally, Parsons argued that the informal curriculum that we also call the hidden curriculum prepares students for adult life and the world of work by indirectly teaching them with the qualities they need to be good workers. Hierarchies in school are about who is in charge and who you have to answer to, which is something that continues into the workplace. Timekeeping and attendance are reinforced by disciplining those who are late and rewarding those with good attendance. Schools promote obedience and conformity, such as wearing a uniform, through sanctions if you don't conform, such as detentions. Even in adult life, you have to follow instructions from others. And finally, achieving status through hard work, just like passing exams or trying out for a team. These are not a given. So let's quickly evaluate the functionalist view of education. Schools perform positive functions for most people. Exclusion rates and truancy rates are very low, and in terms of role allocation, 85% of those with degrees earn more than those without degrees. Schools do try to foster solidarity through things like assembly and PSHE, and education is more work-focused than it has been in the past. Schooling is more meritocratic than it was in the 19th century. However, Marxists would argue that the system is not meritocratic, e.g. private schools benefit the wealthy, which we'll look at in a minute. Functionalism ignores the negative sides of schools, so, for example, bullying, and postmodernists will argue that teaching to the test kills any sort of creativity, and it is also really doubtful that everyone in school has equal opportunity regardless of their social class, their ethnicity or their gender. So the functionalist view is quite rose-tinted. Let's see how well you have been listening. You have 30 seconds to give me 3 ways that school prepares you for adult life and work. Good luck. Okay, how did you get on? Let's have a look at the answers, and if you got them right, well done. So 3 ways schools prepares you for adult life and work. So it develops that organisational and time management skills that are so important. It improves your communication skills, so written and verbal, for example, and problem solving and working with others are all things that you do which are going to be useful when you are entering the world of work. Okay, here's the next one. This time you have 30 seconds to give me 3 ways that schools teach you to achieve status. Off you go. Okay, let's have a look at how you got on. If you managed to get all three, then well done. So 3 ways that schools teach you to achieve status. So firstly, making students earn their positions, such as trying out for teams, auditioning for plays, etc. Reinforcing the importance of social skills, such as manners, and judging students on how hard they work and how well they achieve. Well done if you got that. Right, let's have a look at the feminist view of education. So feminists believe that the hidden curriculum reinforces and transmits patriarchal values. For example, studies have noted traditional family structures in textbooks, along with many other gender stereotypes. They also argue that some subjects are aimed towards specific genders. For example, boys encouraged to take practical subjects and discouraged from things like health and social care, as that's seen as a female subject due to the sort of caring nature of the subject content. They also argue that gender divisions occur in PE and other sports, with different sports offered to boys and girls, both in lessons but also with extracurricular provision. There is also a gender division in labour in schools. Teaching is predominantly a female profession. However, it is men that are overrepresented in the positions of power, with far more male head teachers than female. And the majority of lower paid work in the school is done by women, such as office staff, support staff, canteen staff, cleaners, which gives girls an impression from a really young age that the jobs that are best in society and that pay better are generally done by men. Feminists also argue that girls are often told off for rowdy behaviour that is seen as unladylike, but it is okay for boys to do. So let's have a look at different types of feminists and what their views of education are. So liberal feminists agree that the education system is patriarchal, but there have been huge advances in equality. Perhaps the biggest change since the 1980s is that girls now outperform boys in education. So if the system is a patriarchal one designed to favour boys, it is failing. Today, once subjects become optional, there are quite clear gendered preferences for one subject or another, but all subjects are open to all pupils. Radical feminists argue that the education system is still fundamentally patriarchal and continues to marginalise and oppress women. It does this through some processes that we've already mentioned, such as a hidden curriculum, but also through normalising the marginalisation and oppression of women. So by the time girls leave school, they see it as normal and natural rather than as patriarchal oppression. Radical feminist research has also looked at sexual harassment in education and how it is not treated as seriously as other forms of bullying. What all feminists do agree on is that the education system does work as an agent of secondary socialisation, which teaches girls and boys what are seen as universal norms and values and gender scripts that are actually those of contemporary patriarchy, and that girls and boys learning these values prevents social change and challenges to patriarchy. But when we evaluate feminist views on education, we need to remember that education is an increasingly female-dominated sector. Most teachers are women, and an increasing number of managers are women because they're drawn down from the available teachers. The education system is increasingly resulting in female success and male underperformance. So if this is a system designed to ensure men are in the top positions of society and women are marginalised into a domestic role, then it would appear to be failing. The education system is in fact sending more and more girls into higher education. Right, let's move on to the Marxist view of education. So Marxists suggest that the education system is not meritocratic and it sets up working class pupils to fail in several ways. So they argue that the curriculum is based on the knowledge that middle class and upper class pupils learn at home, so the idea of cultural capital, and the literature and music and history taught in school is based on the interests of the ruling classes. Material factors will prevent working class pupils competing with middle class and upper class pupils, as they might be living in poorer conditions which make private study difficult. They might not be able to afford all the things that add up over the years, such as uniform, trips, computers and a decent internet connection, or even things like revision materials, etc. And of course, middle and upper class pupils have the advantage that their parents might pay for private education or private tutors. So it's certainly not a level playing field between the classes. It's also argued that education acts as a form of social control over pupils and shapes what they think. We call this ideological state apparatus. Those in charge of the education system decide what is useful knowledge and what is not, and they dismiss knowledge that is not on the formal curriculum. Behaviour that is not consistent with the ruling classes is punished, especially uniform attitudes and language, which again is a form of social control. Marxists believe that the schools prepare working class pupils to accept a life of exploitation. Let's think about Bowles and Ginter's correspondence theory here. Marxists also believe that by telling working pupils or working class pupils that meritocracy exists and that if they work hard they will achieve and gain higher status in society, we are lying to them, as they are often disadvantaged by factors outside of school. By pretending they are equal opportunities, we are shifting the blame for working class failure from an unfair and unequal system to the individual worth ethic, stating that if working class pupils fail, it is simply because they didn't work hard enough, which is not the case. When we evaluate the Marxist view, we need to note that they neglect the positive experiences of school for working class pupils, the ability to make social connections and develop their skills and knowledge. They assume that education is a negative experience for working class pupils, which is not the case for most. The second advanced information topic for education is processes within schools. Those processes within school that affect education achievement. So things like streaming and setting, mixed ability grouping, labelling and the self-fulfilling prophecy. Stephen Ball's work on teacher expectation that's linked to setting, and Willis's work on the creation of counter-school cultures and anti-school cultures. Okay, let's have a look at the different in-school factors and processes that influence educational attainment. Each of the key terms has had their vowel removed. Can you work them out? Okay, here is our first one. We'll give you a few moments to have a look and try and work out what the key term is. Okay, hopefully you've worked out it is teacher labelling. Teachers have a huge impact on the educational achievement of their pupils, and much of this is down to the expectations that they have of those pupils, which is linked to how they label certain pupils. We're going to look at this in a bit more detail in a few moments. Okay, here is our next one. Give you a few moments to try and work it out. Okay, hopefully you spotted that it is institutional racism, which refers to policies, practices and procedures in an institution that place one or more groups at a disadvantage because of their ethnic or cultural background. There are several examples of this in the education system. For example, uniform and appearance, which usually reflects Western ideas of work attire and often doesn't allow for cultural dress or allow for certain hairstyles that have cultural significance, such as dreadlocks. School holidays are based around the Christian calendar and holidays, whereas Ramadan often falls during the summer exam period, meaning that those who are fasting are at a disadvantage when sitting their exams. There is also institutional racism on how teachers interact with pupils, so things like unconscious bias being an issue, for example, being determined to help ethnic minority pupils achieve, but believing they are culturally deprived and can't achieve by themselves. Okay, we have our third key term up on the screen. Again, we'll give you a couple of moments to just have a think about what this might be. Okay, did you spot it was the ethnocentric curriculum, which is the idea that the curriculum is based upon the ideas, norms, values and knowledge of white middle-class culture, so places ethnic and minority students at a disadvantage. For example, their cultural background isn't represented, so their parents might not be able to help or support with schoolwork. And the cultural capital of these students, so the knowledge of their own culture and history, for example, is not acknowledged as being worthy as being studied, which can then demotivate and alienate these pupils. However, many argue that the UK is so diverse, making it logistically impossible to study all cultures, so education tends to need to focus on the culture of the majority. Okay, this is a super tricky one, I think, so we'll give you a few moments to try and work it out. Good luck. Okay, let's get it up on the screen. It is a feminisation of education. This refers to changes in the education system that have transformed education from being male-dominated to a female-dominated sector. There have been many reasons for this, such as an increased achievement that has led to labelling girls positively, with teachers perceiving girls to be harder working and having harder aspirations. Therefore, there are also more women studying at university and choosing careers in education, and then becoming positive role models for girls to look up to. Additionally, there has been a drive in recent years to get more girls interested in STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering and maths, which has resulted in a huge increase of girls taking maths and chemistry at A-level, although physics is still dominated by boys. Okay, and our last one is now up on the screen. Slightly easier than the last one, I think. I'll give you a moment or two just to try and work this one out. Okay, so we have setting and streaming. So setting is where children are organised into an ability group based on how well they achieve in that one subject, whereas streaming places pupils into groups based on their overall ability and will be in that stream for several subjects. Now, we also hear these referred to as banding. We will talk about these in more detail in a bit. Okay, so let's think about teacher expectations and labelling and the massive impact that these can have on students. So sociologist Howard Becker, who is an interactionist, found that teachers favoured pupils with characteristics that were linked to middle class attitudes. So teachers have in their heads the idea of an ideal student, and this can be based upon a variety of things such as intelligence, how hard they try, how neat their work is, previous siblings, their background, how they behave in lessons, all sorts of things there. And research has proved that differences in teacher expectations of different social classes, ethnic groups and genders still take place. So labelling can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. A self-fulfilling prophecy is where a label is placed upon a student and it becomes true as a result of the student believing it and acting accordingly to the label they have been given. A very famous example of this is Rosenthal and Jacobson's research into positive perceptions of pupils. They told teachers that certain pupils in their class had been identified as gifted, even though they hadn't, to see whether they would treat them differently. Those pupils did make more progress as they'd been labelled positively and the teachers had higher expectations of them, so pushed them harder. However, it also works the other way when pupils have negative labels attached to them based on teacher stereotypes and expectations, which is shown on the screen. So let's have a quick look at that. So behaviour is observed, a label is attached, behaviour is then reinforced, that label is reinforced, the pupil internalises that label and they can either choose to accept or reject that label. If the pupil accepts that label and performs according to expectations, this is referred to as that self-fulfilling prophecy. Labelling can have further impacts on pupil performance as it can lead to them being placed in sets or streams. Stephen Ball's classic 1981 study sought to investigate why working class pupils underperformed at school. He looked at the effects of teaching by ability and observed that in the top sets children were warmed up, expectations were higher and the work that was given was more challenging, whereas in the lower sets expectations were low and children were effectively cooled down for learning. Low-level disruption was more likely to be tolerated and less homework was given out. The lower sets might also not have access to the same curriculum as the other sets, therefore were limited to how they could achieve in exams. He observed working classes were more likely to gravitate towards these low sets and therefore lose motivation and hate school. He called this downward mobility, which is the opposite of meritocracy. Okay, let's have a look at some of the arguments for and against teaching by mixed ability and also setting by ability with this on-balance activity. It's a good activity to help you get your arguments together for two sides of a debate. So we're going to start off by thinking about the advantages of teaching in mixed ability groups. Try and see if you can come up with two. Okay, so let's have a look. Some of the good things about mixed ability groupings are that there are no labels given to students. So there's no student feeling that they can't do it, there's no glass ceiling, and there's no self-fulfilling prophecy. So a glass ceiling is when you can see the top, but you can't get there because of where you have been placed. There are also light bulb moments when students of lower or middle ability suddenly get it, which is really good for their confidence, and they tend to happen much more in those mixed ability groupings. Okay, let's do the same for disadvantages. So two disadvantages of teaching in mixed ability groups. Give yourself a bit of a pause if you need to. Okay, how did we get on this time? So firstly, we might have brighter students losing interest if the lesson plods on at a slow pace. So they may feel that they're being held back by other students because the teacher is teaching to the middle and not teaching to the top. But we also have at the other end children feeling that they might lose confidence as they feel they can't keep up and they're too embarrassed to ask for help in case they are laughed at or have comments made by other students. Okay, we have evaluated teaching in mixed ability groups. We're now going to do the same for teaching in sets or streams. So can you think of two advantages of teaching in ability groups? So pause the video if you need to. Right, let's see how you got on. So firstly, it's much easier for teachers to stretch those at the top end and support those at the bottom end, so you get much more individualised support, and it's much easier to tailor the content of the lesson to the right level of ability, so there's less planning needed for the teacher, but also it's just easier to support all the students if they are working at a similar ability, whereas you haven't got to cater right for the top, right for the bottom, and for those group in the middle. Okay, let's do the same for disadvantages again. Two disadvantages of teaching in sets or streams that are streamed by ability. So pause the video if you need to. So firstly, you have that stigmatisation of lower ability groups. So the idea of labelling, so being in a bottom set, doesn't do much good for the esteem of some of those children in there. Sometimes those bottom sets are also categorised by quite poor behaviour, so that can be quite demoralising for students that are in the bottom sets as well. But you also have the idea that expectations for middle and lower sets are often too low, so their attainment is lower than if they were taught a mixed ability. So we talked earlier about the idea of them being cooled down and expectations being far lower than they should be. Okay, once again, remember there is a massive importance to making sure your arguments are balanced. This activity is a really good way of getting you to think about both sides of a debate. Obviously, in the exam, you don't have a pair of scales that you can use like this, but it is worth just noting down a couple of bullet points on either side when you're thinking about planning those 12-mark essays. Okay, the last thing that we're going to talk about in this video is Willis and his anti-school subculture study. So as a Marxist, Paul Willis was interested in conflict in schools and why working class boys generally went on to do working class jobs. His classic study, Learning to Labour from 1977, involved observations and unstructured interviews, and it focused on a group of lads, a group of working class boys who were disruptive, misbehaved and hated school. In their subculture, it was called to mess about and fail, which went against the school values. They did not want to get praise from teachers. They wanted praise from within their group for truancy, bad behaviour, showing offensive attitudes such as racism, sexism and homophobia. And they saw school as boring and pointless, which was something they had to endure until they could go off to work. And for most of them, it was irrelevant, as the jobs that they wanted to do didn't need any sort of qualifications anyway, so they actively chose to act out against education. It is worth pointing out that laddie subcultures are not limited purely to working class boys, as middle class boys often display them too, although they are much more likely to be forced to knuckle down outside of school by their parents. Right, we're going to do a quick 4-mark question based on Willis's study. So the question is, identify one method that Willis used in his research and explain one advantage of using that method in researching anti-school subcultures. So there are 3 key things to note here. Firstly, you need to identify one method. Secondly, you need to identify an advantage of this method. And thirdly, you need to identify why this was an advantage in investigating this specific group. So in red, we have our one method. So one method used by Willis in his research was unstructured interviews. In blue, we have our advantage of the method. So an advantage of this method was it enabled Willis to develop a rapport with the boys he was studying. And then in green, why was this particularly an advantage for this specific group? It was an advantage as the boys were part of an anti-school subculture and may have viewed Willis with suspicion or been unwilling to talk to him if they thought he was an authority figure. Being able to connect with them meant that he could get more in-depth answers for them. So there we are, a good 4-marker that we have divided up so you can see where those marks have been. So we're going to end this session by looking at a couple of 12-marker questions. Here is our first one. Discuss how far sociologists would agree that the main purpose of education is to promote social mobility. Okay, so how do we tackle this question? Well, we start off by decoding the question. Discuss questions ask you to present at least 2 different sides of a debate. In this case, all 3 main sociological viewpoints have strong opinions on this debate, so you can actually present 3 of them here. You then write an introduction. This doesn't need to be detailed, but it's just a good way of signposting to your examiner that you are aware of the different opinions in this debate and you actually know what you're talking about. You're going to be summarising them in this mini essay. A good way to start is to summarise the arguments and then briefly outline what they each suggest. But the introduction should be no longer than 4 lines because it is brief. Okay, let's move on to the main body. So it should have at least 2 paragraphs, but in this one, it'd be good to talk about the functionalist, Marxist and feminist viewpoints on the debate. So therefore, I would have 3 paragraphs. So remember, it's about social mobility. So functionalists would suggest, so you can start talking about the idea of meritocracy, you can talk about role allocation, there's all sorts of things that you could have in that first paragraph. Alternatively, Marxists would suggest you can start talking about the idea here of Bowes and Gintes and their correspondence theory, and that school is simply training children to be workers that are not going to unite and try and fight for better conditions in the workplace. And then similarly, feminists would suggest that, and you can start talking about the hidden curriculum. You could talk about girls being given these messages that they're not as good as boys because men are in positions of power within the school. So there's lots of things that you could include there. Notice use of signposting to show that you are contrasting different approaches. So I've underlined the signposting on the screen. So in this type of essay, remember that functionalists, Marxists and feminists would all agree agree that something happens, however they would disagree on the reasons it happens. So functionalists are much more positive about the functions of education, while Marxists and feminists like to take a conflict approach. They don't agree that schools work to the best. So let's finish off with our conclusion. So it's essential to have a conclusion to reach that top band for the essay. Obviously, that the rest of your essay needs to be good enough in the first place to get there, but you won't get to the top band if you don't have a conclusion. Your conclusion should make a judgment on which of the approaches you believe has the most validity. So in this case, which of the 3 sociological viewpoints presents the most convincing argument. So, for example, we have a conclusion here. In conclusion, it can be argued that one of the purposes of education is to promote social mobility. However, it is often dependent on the ethos of the school, attitudes of teachers to help the working class and female students, and social attitudes to employment in wider society. So, a really brief summary, just a few lines, presenting or recapping some of the points that have been made in an earlier essay. So we have one more 12 marker to have a think about. So this time, the title is Discuss How Far Sociologists Would Agree That the Main Function of the Education System is to socialise children into the norms and values of society. Okay, so this time I've presented the main ideas in the form of a table, just to summarise them really succinctly, really briefly. Obviously, you need to present them in much more detail. So, yes, functionalists agree with this. One of the functions of the education system is to socialise children into the value consensus of society. Marxists would agree, yes, it does socialise children into the norms and the values of society. However, these are the norms and values of the ruling classes. And feminists, yes, it socialises children into patriarchal norms and values that maintain gender differences in society. So the 3 parties, or the 3 sociological viewpoints here, are all agreeing that it does socialise them into the norms and values, but it's only the functionalists believe that this is a good thing. Marxists and feminists don't necessarily believe that it is a good thing. But what you do need to do is you also need to offer some alternatives. So what other functions apart from socialisation does education perform? So on the screen here we've got 4 bullet points. We've got serves the need of capitalism, promotes social mobility, teaches specialist skills, and promotes social cohesion. So you would need to pick a couple of those and outline them in alternative views in those nice long detailed paragraphs, and then you need to conclude and make a judgment on which argument you believe is the most valid and why. Then doesn't need to be any more than 50 words in a conclusion. It needs to be nice, short, sharp and sweet to summarise what you have argued in your main body. Okay, now if I was you, in preparation for Monday's exam, I would go and have a go at those 12 markers. And if you haven't already had a go at the ones on the family video, have a go at those too. Right, well done if you've made it to the end. In the video we've covered in detail the advanced information topics for education, which hopefully will help increase your confidence when you go into that exam on Monday for paper 1. Don't forget to watch the warm-up video for families if you haven't already done so, and keep an eye out for the paper 2 videos on crime and deviance and social stratification that are going to be available to you really shortly. Good luck on Monday. I'm sure you will be amazing. Well done.